James Bennett stood at the kitchen sink, holding a coffee mug he had already forgotten he'd filled moments ago. The warm morning light streamed through the window, illuminating the quiet Ohio home he had shared with Carol for over 40 years. His hands trembled slightly, but what shook more was the weight of the silence between them. Carol sat at the dining table, her eyes on a folded letter from the memory clinic they'd visited just 2 weeks earlier. James had always been the dependable one, the father who fixed leaky faucets and mowed the lawn every Saturday, the husband who remembered anniversaries before Carol did. But lately, names slipped away from him like leaves in the wind. He confused the days, misplaced his keys, and once called Emily by his sister's name. It scared them both, though neither had the strength to admit it aloud. Carol, ever the practical one, had been holding them together, compensating for his lapses without complaint. But beneath her calm presence, she was exhausted. The quiet sobs behind the bathroom door, the grocery list rewritten multiple times, because James, throughout the originals, her days had become a loop of managing, protecting, and quietly grieving the man still sitting beside her. Their children, Emily, Josh, and Lauren, had started noticing too. They lived in different parts of the state, busy with their own careers and families. Emily, a teacher, had come over one Sunday and found James watering the plants at night. She didn't say anything then, but the group call that followed was inevitable. That call had been difficult. Maybe it's time to look into more help, Emily had suggested gently. Like what? Carol asked, already knowing the answer. A facility, Josh said, too blunt for Carol's liking. Somewhere safe. Lauren hesitated before adding, not because we don't care, but because we do. Carol hadn't said much after that. James had just stared at the floor, his expression unreadable. Now, the silence between them was different. It was not filled with confusion or fear. It was filled with decision. Carol folded the letter and placed it in her purse. Let's take a drive, she said, her voice steady but gentle. James looked at her, unsure. Where? Nowhere in particular. Just away. For a bit. He nodded slowly. Okay. They packed lightly, just enough for a few days. Carol told the kids they were going to take some time to think things over before making any big decisions. She didn't mention where. Neither did James. The old Buick still ran fine, even if it groaned when starting. James insisted on driving, and Carol let him, watching quietly as he backed out of the driveway with a caution he never used to need. They didn't talk much at first. The familiar roads gave way to country lanes, golden fields stretching endlessly on both sides. The landscape seemed unchanged from the days when they would pile the kids in the backseat and go on weekend drives. Carol glanced at James occasionally. He looked calm, focused. Hours passed. They stopped at a roadside diner for lunch, the kind with faded booths and waitresses who called everyone Hun. Carol ordered for both of them. James smiled at a little boy at the next table, who was trying to balance a spoon on his nose. The boy giggled. James laughed too. Carol's chest tightened. Later, as the sun dipped low, Carol finally spoke. Do you remember when we drove through Athens that summer? The kids were so little. James squinted. The fair with the blue ribbon goats? Carol laughed. That's the one. He smiled, a trace of the old spark in his eyes. Lauren cried when she thought the goat was going to eat her bracelet. She was only 5, Carol said, her smile fading as quickly as it came. It was a good summer. They drove on, past towns whose names they barely remembered, but whose streets brought back flashes. Emily learned to ride a bike in a motel parking lot, Josh getting sick from too many hot dogs, the three of them asleep in the back seat as James and Carol sang quietly to the radio. Carol was chasing something on this trip. Not answers, and not even closure. She was chasing time, those last few years that slipped by while they were busy holding everything together. They stopped at a small inn just before dark. It wasn't much, but it had a vacancy. The owner, a man in his 60s, gave them a curious look but welcomed them in. Carol signed the register. James wandered toward the fireplace in the lobby and stood there for a long time. In the room that night, Carol sat by the window while James dozed. The stars outside looked brighter than they did back home. Maybe it was a lack of city lights. Maybe it was something else. She pulled out her notebook. A blank page stared back at her. For the first time in months, she wrote something just for herself. "We are not ready to be put away." The next morning, Carol didn't call the kids. Neither did James. They decided to stay an extra night, and then another. Without quite meaning to, they had taken the first step away from the life they had always known, toward something uncertain, yes, but also full of possibility. Something inside them, fragile and still healing, had stirred. They weren't running away. They were waking up. The third morning away from home arrived with a strange, weightless quiet. The motel room was small, but sunlight filtered softly through the gauzy curtains, and outside, the hum of distant traffic mingled with the low whistle of the wind brushing past the eaves. Carol sat at the edge of the bed, lacing her shoes. James stood by the mirror, adjusting the collar of his shirt for the third time, then forgetting why he had been doing so in the first place. Carol didn't mention it. She just watched him calmly, and when he finally turned to her with that half-lost look in his eyes, she smiled. "Breakfast?" she offered. "Sounds good," he said. Downstairs, the innkeeper greeted them with a nod. "Heading out today?" Carol hesitated. "Actually, we're not sure yet." The man chuckled. "Well, stay as long as you like. Not often we get guests who don't rush through." That comment stayed with Carol as they ate. She watched James stir his coffee absent-mindedly and realized she wasn't in a rush either. There was something about this town, its slow rhythm, its small-town warmth, that invited pause. They wandered to the quiet streets after breakfast. No agenda, no ticking clock. The town was modest. A hardware store with a creaky front door, a post office with hand-painted signs, a church with stained glass windows depicting scenes that hadn't changed in generations. In front of a small bakery, a boy held the door for an elderly woman. Carol noticed how everyone nodded to one another, how the cashier at the pharmacy knew customers by name. It reminded her of how things used to feel. Less hurried, more human. James seemed lighter too. He stopped to admire a rusted pickup parked under an oak tree, ran his hand along the bed as if recalling one he once owned. They passed a community bulletin board, and he studied it with genuine interest. "Look," he said, pointing. "They got a woodshop club." Carol leaned in. A handwritten flyer, pinned between announcements for church picnics and a missing cat, invited locals to join a once-a-week gathering to carve, build, and share skills. She hadn't seen James this focused in weeks. "You want to go?" she asked gently. He nodded slowly, still staring at the flyer. "I think I'd like that." It was only Tuesday. The meeting was Friday. For the first time in years, Carol said something she hadn't even considered back home. "Then let's stay until Friday." The words felt good, decisive, freeing. James blinked at her, surprised, and then smiled, genuinely, deeply. They returned to the inn, extended their stay, and began treating their time not as a stopover, but as something more intentional. That afternoon, they drove to a lake just a few miles outside of town. James kicked off his shoes and waded ankle-deep into water, grinning like a teenager. Carol sat on a fallen log, letting the breeze tug at her sleeves, thinking of nothing except how beautiful it all was. When they returned that evening, James was tired but content. Carol helped him settle on the small couch in their room, and he fell asleep with the television on low. She stepped outside to call Emily, but after dialing, her thumb hovered over the call button. Then, slowly, she locked the screen and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Not yet. The following day, Carol visited the local library. It was a red brick building with ivy crawling up one side and a large maple tree shading the entrance. Inside, the librarian, a woman with silver hair and a scarf that matched her glasses, greeted her with quiet warmth. "I'm just browsing," Carol said. "Take your time." She wandered the shelves, not really looking for anything in particular, until her fingers landed on a photography book featuring landscapes of Vermont. The title meant little until she opened it. The green hills, misty mornings, and winding paths struck a deep, unexpected chord. She remembered something James had mentioned long ago, a property, land left to him by his grandfather somewhere in Vermont. It had always been a vague memory, half believed, half dismissed, lost of time in life's busyness. That night, she brought it up. "Do you remember that land your grandfather left you? James furrowed his brow. Land? In Vermont. You used to talk about it sometimes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, as if dusting off an old box in his mind, he nodded slowly. A cabin near Montpelier. I think we only went once, when we were first married. Carol leaned forward. Do you remember where it was? He closed his eyes, thinking. There was a lake, big, and hills, trees so thick you couldn't see the sky sometimes. I remember driving through a covered bridge. She watched his face as it came to him, piece by piece. The way his eyes lit up, the certainty in his voice as he recalled details buried for decades. It made her heart ache, not just for the past, but for what might still be possible. What if we went there? She asked. James looked at her. Now, why not? He laughed softly, not in dismissal, but in wonder. I thought you want to go back home. Carol shook her head. I'm not ready to go back. Not to the city. Not to all of it. He nodded, almost solemnly. Neither am I. It was a quiet pact, sealed without ceremony. They would go. The next morning, Carol made a stop at the local cafe to ask if anyone had ever heard of a route to Vermont that passed through covered bridges. The young woman behind the counter smiled and said, You'd be surprised how many old roads lead there. That evening, Carol wrote in her notebook again. We decided not to return. Not yet. Maybe not ever. James attended the woodshop club on Friday. Carol waited in the car, uncertain if he'd manage, unsure how long he'd stay. But when he came out over 2 hours later, smelling of sawdust and holding a small wooden birdhouse, she nearly cried. They want me to come back next week, he said. They said I have good hands. You do, she said, placing her hand over his. That night, James brought out an old map he found in the glove compartment. It was worn, edges curled, but it traced a route northeast toward Vermont. They highlighted the roads with a pen borrowed from the innkeeper. The man asked if they were heading home. No, Carol replied simply. We're going somewhere new. On Sunday morning, they loaded the Buick again. As they pulled away, the town faded behind them slowly, not like something they were leaving, but like something that had given them the strength to continue. It had not been a detour. It had been the beginning of something they didn't yet have words for. Carol drove this time, James navigating with the map open on his lap. Vermont was still far off, but for the first time in a long time, distance did not feel daunting. It felt like hope. Emily Bennett paced her apartment with the phone pressed to her ear, the sound of yet another voicemail tone drawing out longer than her patience could allow. She ended the call with a sharp tap of her thumb, let out a slow breath, then immediately hit redial. Still nothing. Come on, Mom, she muttered. Pick up. It had been 4 days since she had last heard her mother's voice. The call had been brief, Carol assuring her they were simply taking time to clear their heads, that they would talk soon. But soon had come and gone, and every call since then had gone straight to voicemail. Emily wasn't someone prone to panic, but there was a tightness in her chest that wouldn't ease. She stood by the window, watching the early evening roll in over the city skyline. In her hands, her phone buzzed again, this time a text from her brother. Josh, still nothing? She replied instantly. Emily, no. I've called 7 times today. Yesterday, too. Straight to voicemail. Josh. Maybe they're just turning it off to enjoy the break. Emily, it's been 4 days. That's not a break. That's a disappearance. Josh didn't answer right away. Emily waited, then finally tossed the phone on the couch and went to pour herself a glass of water, her mind racing. She tried to think logically. Her parents weren't reckless people, but they weren't young anymore either. What if something had happened? What if James had gotten lost? What if they were stuck somewhere without help? The doorbell rang. She flinched, then remembered Lauren had said she might come by. She opened the door to her younger sister's concerned face. Lauren stepped in, pulling her jacket off. I brought coffee, she said quietly. Emily accepted the cup and gestured toward the living room. They sat, both sipping in silence for a moment. The city outside seemed indifferent to their anxiety. Cars moved. Lights blinked on in windows. Someone laughed in the hallway. They're not back. Lauren said, not as a question, but a confirmation of what she already knew. Emily nodded. Nothing. No text. No call. It's not like Mom. Dad, either, Lauren agreed. Even when he forgot things, he never just disappeared. Josh joined the call via video not long after. He appeared on screen looking disheveled and irritated, a basketball game muted on the television behind him. I think we're overreacting, he said immediately. They said they needed space. Maybe this is that. Emily leaned forward, her voice sharp. Josh, space is one thing. Radio silence is another. We don't know where they are. We don't know who they're with. They didn't even say what direction they were headed. Lauren interjected, her tone more measured. They haven't used their credit card since last Tuesday. I checked with the bank. That's 6 days ago. Nothing since then. Not even gas. Josh frowned. How did you get access to their account? Lauren waved it off. Mom gave me her login years ago when she had surgery. I never deleted it. Emily stood, her anxiety boiling into motion. We need to do something. Call someone. Report them missing. Maybe. Josh sighed. They're not missing. They're grown adults who don't want to be bothered. But what if they're missing? Emily asked, what if something happened on the road? What if Dad got confused and drove the wrong way? Lauren looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. Or what if they just don't come back? That suggestion hung in the air like smoke. Josh shook his head. No way. That's not them. Are you sure? Lauren asked, do you even know who they are anymore? I mean, we've been treating them like they're fragile, like they can't make decisions. What if they're just done with all of that? Emily rubbed her temples. This isn't about autonomy. This is about safety. No, Lauren said more firmly now. This is about control. Josh, perhaps uncharacteristically, stayed silent at that. Emily opened her mouth to reply but stopped. The words Lauren had spoken echoed in her head in a way she didn't like. Control. Was that what this had become? Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, James and Carol sat quietly in a roadside diner along a quiet two-lane highway, the type of place with a jukebox that still played old vinyls and menus laminated, so often the edges curled. James was studying a map spread across the table, tracing a potential route to Montpelier. Carol sipped her tea, glancing at her phone now and then. It sat on the table, turned off. She hadn't powered it back on since Wednesday. You think they're worried? James asked, not looking up. Carol didn't answer immediately. She stared at the phone, a small block of silence between her and the rest of the world. They probably are, she finally said. But right now, I think we need this more than they need answers. James nodded slowly, his finger pausing at a small lake symbol near a crooked line of road. I think I remember this place. My grandfather took me fishing there once. I was 10. Carol leaned in, squinting at the map. Looks out of the way. That's why I like it. The waitress came by, refilling their mugs. You two passing through? She asked cheerfully. We're trying to find somewhere, Carol replied. Not somewhere, James corrected gently. We're trying to remember it. The woman laughed softly. Well, you picked the right place. We don't forget much around here. When they returned to the motel that night, a small, quiet place tucked between a grove of trees, they unpacked their few things without ceremony. Carol pulled out the journal she'd been keeping. She wrote only one sentence that evening. We are not lost. Back in Ohio, Emily sat alone in her darkened living room. Josh had ended the call in frustration. Lauren had gone home, but Emily couldn't sleep. She stared at her phone for hours, trying to decide whether to call the police. She didn't, but not because she wasn't worried. She didn't because in her heart, she knew something had changed, and it wasn't necessarily something wrong. Her parents weren't missing. They were absent, yes, but not lost. Somewhere out there, they had made a choice, and that terrified her more than anything. The rain came gently that morning, a thin veil misting the windshield as Carol steered the Buick down a winding back road lined with thick trees. The sky was overcast, but not unkind. It gave the landscape a muted softness, a quiet that felt almost deliberate. James sat beside her with a map folded neatly on his lap, though they had stopped checking hours ago. The road had become its own kind of compass. They had been driving northeast for 3 days, stopping only when tiredness settled in or when something caught their attention. A crooked fence, a sign for homemade preserves, a roadside bench overlooking a stream. They slept in modest motels, paid in cash, and rarely saw the same face twice. The anonymity of it was liberating. The silence between them had shifted too. It was no longer heavy with things unsaid. It had become companionable, restful, and in some small way, healing. By early afternoon, they passed a wooden sign painted in fading red letters. Welcome to Fox Hollow. Population 841. Carol eased off the gas. The town looked like something from an old novel. Storefronts with carved wooden trim, hand-painted signs hanging from wrought iron brackets, and a main street so narrow it felt like the past had folded itself into the present. A bell above the general store door rang as they stepped inside. The floorboards creaked beneath their shoes. Shelves held everything from canned peaches to jigsaw puzzles to knitting needles. Behind the counter stood a man in his 70s, tall and spare, with hands that looked like they'd spent decades working with tools. He greeted them without surprise, as if they were expected. Just passing through, he asked. Carol smiled. Maybe, or maybe not. James took an interest in a display of locally made soaps, running his fingers over the paper-wrapped bars. The scent of lavender and cedar lingered in the air. The man behind the counter leaned in slightly. You should talk to Eli down at the mill. He used to run a wood shop out of his barn. He's always looking for company. James perked up. Wood shop, just off Maple Lane. Big red barn. You can't miss it. Carol thanked the man and bought a jar of blueberry jam before they left. They found the barn easily. It stood near the edge of town, its red paint chipped, its roof rusted but solid. Inside, they were met with the smell of sawdust and the sound of a hand plane skimming across wood. Eli was a broad-shouldered man with a gray beard and a voice like gravel. Looking for something? He asked without looking up. James stepped forward. Just wondering if you still work with your hands. Eli paused and turned. His eyes flicked to James's weathered fingers, the posture of someone familiar with tools, and he gave a slight nod. You know your way around a chisel? I used to, James said. Then come on in. For the next 2 hours, Carol sat on an overturned crate near the barn door, watching James and Eli work. They didn't talk much, but the rhythm of their motions, the shared language of measurement and material, filled the space like music. James looked more himself than he had in months. There was a clarity to his expression, a purpose to the way he held the wood. When Eli finally offered him a stool and a cold lemonade, James didn't hesitate. We're staying in town for a couple of days, Carol said, almost as a question to herself. Plenty of quiet here, Eli replied, and good people. That night, they rented a small cabin on the edge of the nearby forest. It wasn't fancy, just a one-bedroom with a stove and a porch that faced west. But Carol found herself exhaling in a way she hadn't even realized she'd been holding back. The next morning, James returned to the barn. Carol wandered into the center of town and stumbled upon a community garden tucked behind the library. A group of older women was pulling weeds, arranging fall mums, and setting up baskets of vegetables for donation. You knew, one of them asked without looking up. Just visiting, Carol replied. Visiting turns into staying if you're not careful, another woman said with a grin. They offered her a pair of gloves. She hesitated, then slipped them on. It felt good, grounding. Her hands remembered how to coax life from the soil, even if it had been years. Over the next several days, a gentle rhythm emerged. James worked with Eli during the mornings, helping refurbish old furniture and build small commissions for the town. A bench for the schoolyard, a sign for the bakery. Carol joined the garden crew, then helped at the local thrift shop, where she spent hours organizing books, sewing buttons back on donated coats, and trading stories with women whose lives seemed both foreign and achingly familiar. In the evenings, they returned to cabin. They cooked simple meals, sat on the porch, and talked more than they had in years. Not about the past or what they had lost, but about the present, what they were discovering, who they still were beneath all the roles they'd been carrying. One evening, Carol lit a fire in the wood stove, and James sat across from her with a sketch pad. He hadn't drawn since before Emily was born. Now he did it without fanfare, as though his hands had been waiting for permission. "What are you drawing?" she asked softly. He turned the pad toward her. It was the cabin. Their porch, a little out of proportion, a little rough, but unmistakable. "I think," he said, "I'd like to stay a bit longer." Carol nodded. "Me too." Neither of them mentioned the children. Neither of them powered on their phones. The silence between them and the outside world was no longer anxious. It was deliberate, protective. In Fox Hollow, they weren't the couple deal with decline. They weren't aging parents or burdens in the making. They were simply James and Carol, people with skills, with stories, with something still left to offer. And as they lay in bed that night, listening to the quiet rustle of trees outside, James whispered, "I feel like myself again." Carol reached for his hand. "You are yourself. You've always been." In that small town, surrounded by strangers who had become familiar, without demanding anything, James and Carol weren't trying to escape their lives. They were rediscovering them. The map was buried beneath old magazines in the glove compartment, its creases worn soft by decades of folding and unfolding. James pulled out on a quiet Thursday morning as Carol was tidying the cabin's small kitchen. She heard the rustle of paper and turned just in time to see him spreading across the table like someone uncovering a long-lost treasure. He tapped at the faded outline of Vermont with a slow, thoughtful finger. "Do you remember," he said, "that story my grandfather used to tell? About the cabin by the lake, the one with no electricity and a roof full of stars." Carol dried her hands on a dish towel and walked over. She hadn't heard that name, Marble Creek, in years, but as soon as James said it, something stirred in her. A long-ago image returned of her, barely 20, sitting beside a fire while James read aloud from a weathered book of poetry, both of them wrapped in a single wool blanket. "I thought that place was sold," she said. James shook his head. "It was never sold. I just stopped thinking about it. Life got busy. Kids, work. I don't even remember the last time I saw the deed." Carol looked at him, uncertain. "So you think it's still yours?" He folded the map carefully. "It might be, and if it is, maybe it's time we saw it again." By late morning, they were on the road. Fox Hollow faded in the rearview mirror, a town that had offered them respite, but not permanence. The road ahead was long, the scenery shifting gradually from farmland to forested hills. James navigated from memory more than maps, giving vague directions that somehow led them the right way. The farther north they drove, the quieter everything became. Traffic thinned to almost nothing, and the trees grew dense and tall. Towns became clusters of homes rather than grids of streets. By evening, they arrived at a small town just outside what James believed was the area his grandfather had once described. They checked into a modest inn with a wraparound porch and old rocking chairs out front. The owner, a woman named Mabel, asked for their names and then paused as she wrote them in the guest book. "Bennett," she repeated. "I knew a Henry Bennett once. Built furniture. Used to live up past Marble Creek." James looked up, surprised. "That was my grandfather." Mabel's eyes softened. "Well, how about that? I haven't heard that name in years. He was a good man. Quiet. Used to bring down jars of apple preserves every fall." James smiled, pleased. "Do you know if that land up there is still standing?" "The old cabin?" Mabel thought a moment. "Far as I know, no one ever bought it. Last time I went up that way, the road was washed out. But if it's still yours, you might have something special on your hands." Carol asked a question neither of them had yet said aloud. "Would we be able to find it?" Mabel reached under the counter and pulled out a hand-drawn map, yellowed and dog-eared. People used to hike up there back in the day. You'll need a good vehicle. And probably a chainsaw for the fallen trees. The next morning, they loaded up supplies, extra water, a chainsaw borrowed from the innkeeper's husband, and a cooler of food. They followed the crude directions into the wilderness, the road turning quickly from paved to gravel to something barely resembling a path. The forest thickened, moss crept up tree trunks, and branches arched overhead like an ancient cathedral. James drove carefully, avoiding rocks and potholes. After nearly 2 hours of slow climbing, the trail opened slightly, revealing a clearing. The cabin stood ahead. It was smaller than Carol remembered, more weathered, but unmistakably intact. One corner of the roof sagged under years of snow. The door hung crooked on its hinges. Tall grass and brambles had overtaken the porch, and a rusted shovel leaned against the side wall like a relic. They stepped out of the car in silence. James walked forward first, placing his hand on the wooden railing. It held firm. "This is it," he said. "This is really it." Carol followed him inside. Dust floated in beams of sunlight through cracked windows. The air smelled of old pine and thyme. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A narrow staircase led to a loft above. In one corner, a small iron stove stood, its legs rusted but steady. There were still things inside. A woven blanket folded neatly on a shelf. A coffee tin filled with rusty nails. A jar of matches in a glass cupboard. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, but untouched, as if waiting for someone to return. They spent hours cleaning that day. James swept while Carol wiped down surfaces. They opened the windows and let in the scent of fresh pine and cold mountain air. The chainsaw roared outside as James cleared fallen limbs from the path. Carol built a fire in the old hearth and stood watching it catch, warmth spreading slowly through the space. That night, they slept on sleeping bags beside the fire, wrapped in that same wool blanket from decades earlier. James stared at the ceiling beams above them. "I forgot how peaceful this place was," he said. Carol smiled. "I didn't." Over the next several days, the cabin became more than just a memory. It became a possibility. James repaired the roof with local timber. He chopped and planed himself. Carol cleaned the cupboards, lined shelves, scrubbed the floorboards until they gleamed. They hung lanterns, stocked the pantry with dry goods, and brought in blankets and books from the town below. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was a vision of something new. Late one afternoon, James found a metal box under a loose floorboard in the loft. Inside were old documents, yellow deeds, handwritten notes, and one photograph of Henry Bennett standing in front of the cabin with a young boy, James himself, maybe 6 years old, holding a fishing rod. Among the papers was a folded legal document dated over 50 years ago, a deed of ownership, signed and sealed, transferring property to James upon his grandfather's passing. He stared at it for a long time. Then he handed it to Carol. "It's ours," he said simply. She read the name, the boundary lines, the date. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her coat pocket. "We don't have to tell them yet," she said, referring to the children. James nodded. "Not yet." That night, they lit candles instead of lanterns. The fire crackled. Rain tapped softly against the roof, steady but gentle. They sat in silence, wrapped in a blanket, not as a couple escaping responsibility or age, but as two people who had remembered something precious, what it meant to truly belong somewhere, not to a house, but to each other, and to the life they were building again, one quiet step at a time. Emily Bennett was halfway through a morning staff meeting when her phone vibrated. At first, she ignored it. Her principal was reviewing midterm testing schedules, but when it buzzed again seconds later, she glanced down and saw the name. Law offices of Bradshaw, Kelman, and Hartwell. She frowned and excused herself quietly from the room, stepping into the hallway with a mix of curiosity and mild apprehension. The voice on the other end was calm, polite, and very specific. "Miss Bennett, we're calling regarding a recent update to the estate planning file of your father, Mr. James Bennett. Is now a good time to talk." Emily felt a chill run through her. "Estate planning?" "Yes. Your father requested amendments to his will about 10 days ago, and per state law, we're required to notify all listed beneficiaries." She blinked, struggling to reconcile what she was hearing. "You spoke with my father recently?" "That's correct. He visited our Vermont office in person. He was accompanied by your mother. Both seemed well and fully aware of the legal changes being made." Emily's heart pounded faster. "Vermont? What kind of changes?" "We can't go into full details unless you request a formal copy, but a major update concerns the inclusion of a property asset previously not listed. Land in a structure located in Marble Creek, Vermont." Emily pressed her fingers to her temple. We've never heard of that place. It appears the land was inherited from his grandfather. Records show your father took legal possession of it decades ago, but never disclosed it in his prior estate filings. Her voice caught. And now it's in the will? Yes. He's made arrangements regarding its designation and maintenance. If you like the full documents, we can send them by certified mail or provide a scanned version via secure email. Send both, Emily said. After hanging up, she stood in the hallway for a long moment, the buzz of fluorescent lights overhead matching the low thrum in her chest. Then she called Lauren. When her sister picked up, Emily skipped the greetings. They're in Vermont. What? I just got a call from a law office. Dad updated his will. In Vermont. There was silence, then a slow exhale. He updated his will? Without telling us. Yes, and apparently there's land. A property. Some kind of cabin. Lauren didn't respond immediately, and Emily could hear her typing something in the background. Marble Creek. Lauren finally said, That's way up north. Practically nowhere. I'm getting the full documents sent over now. Josh joined the call later that afternoon, his voice already defensive. Okay, let's slow down. Just because they changed the will doesn't mean something bad is happening. Emily snapped. Josh, they've been gone for over 2 weeks. They're not answering our calls. And now we find out they've been working with a lawyer in secret. They're allowed to have privacy, he said. They're also our parents, she replied. And this feels deliberate. Lauren chimed in. I think they don't want to be found. Or maybe they want to be found on their terms. Or maybe Dad's not okay, and Mom's trying to shield us from how bad things are. Emily added. We don't know. Josh sighed. So what do you want to do? Show up unannounced? Force them to explain? No, Emily said slowly. I want to understand what's going on first. Once I get the documents, we'll know more. The papers arrived the next morning, both digitally and in a thick envelope. Emily sat at her dining table with a highlighter and a notebook, reading every line. The cabin existed. It was real. The deed was signed, notarized, and active. The property included several acres of forested land and a small structure listed as a seasonal dwelling, with no running water but legal access to a freshwater spring. It had remained untouched for decades. Taxes paid in small automatic withdrawals from an account James had quietly maintained for years. But what caught Emily's attention most was a letter attached to the will, one not written by the lawyer, but by her father. To my children, if you're reading this, it means I've made a decision, not because I lost faith in you or in your love for us, but because I realized something important. Your mother and I spent our lives working, raising, surviving, and somewhere along the way, we forgot what it meant to just live. The cabin isn't just land. It's a memory, a piece of who I was before I forgot myself. And now in my last chapters, I found that version of me again. We're okay. We're safe. But we need time. Together, alone, away from what the world thinks aging should look like. I'm not waiting for decline. I'm choosing presence. You'll find us when it's time. Until then, trust us. Trust this. Dad. Emily didn't cry. Not immediately. Instead, she sat there, reading the letter 3 times, her breath catching only when she reached the words choosing presence again. Later that evening, the siblings met at Lauren's apartment. Josh held the letter in both hands, rereading silently while Lauren stared at the table, unreadable. I feel like I should be angry, Emily said softly, but I'm not. Josh finally spoke. He's not confused. That much is clear. He might still be sick, Lauren said. We don't know how often he's lucid. But we know he's not lost, Emily replied. And neither is Mom. This wasn't an accident. They sat in silence for a while. Finally, Josh looked up. So now what? We wait, Lauren said, surprised at herself. If we chase them, we'll only make them hide more. But if we listen, maybe they'll let us in again, on their terms. Emily wasn't sure she could bear waiting, but she nodded, because in her heart, she understood. Their parents hadn't abandoned them. They had simply chosen something different. And that choice, however painful, deserved to be honored for now. The morning frost clung to the window panes as James sat on the porch steps, staring at the line of trees where the sun had begun to climb. A mist lingered over the nearby lake, giving the clearing an ethereal quality. In the stillness, he felt grounded, not just in place, but in time. There was no rush, no obligation, no countdown. Each moment was full in itself. Carol came outside carrying 2 enamel mugs. She handed him one, the steam curling up between them. "You didn't sleep," she said gently. He gave a half smile. "Not much. I kept thinking about the trail behind the lake. I'm pretty sure it leads up toward the old quarry. My grandfather used to take me fishing up there when I was a boy." She sat beside him, her hands cupped around her mug. "We should go," she said. "See what's changed." He nodded. "Let's bring a compass this time." It wasn't just a casual outing. It was a part of something unspoken they'd begun piecing together. Memories they were actively reclaiming. For James, the journey wasn't about nostalgia alone. It was about anchoring his mind to something real, something that belonged to him no matter what time tried to erase. They packed a small canvas bag with trail mix, apples, and 2 canteens. James took the lead, walking with a steadiness Carol hadn't seen in weeks. She followed, alert, letting the rhythm of their steps settle into a comfortable sync. The forest welcomed them. Pine needles muffled their footsteps, and the air carried the scent of wet bark in early autumn. James paused occasionally, pointing out old markers, tree carvings, a rusted tin nailed to a trunk, even a hollow stump he swore used to house a raccoon. They reached the ridge by mid-morning. From there, the view spilled open, revealing rolling hills tinged in orange and red. In the distance, Marble Creek shimmered like a thread of silver. James sat on a flat rock, breathing deeply. "It's strange," he said. "The more we walk these paths, the clearer everything becomes. I don't just remember this. I feel it, like it's part of me." Carol sat beside him. "That's because it is." They stayed on the ridge until the sun climbed higher, then made their way down slowly, careful of roots and slick leaves. James stumbled once but caught himself, chuckling as Carol offered a steadying arm. By the time they returned to the cabin, a thin envelope had been pushed under the front door. No return address, just their names in black ink. Carol picked it up, turning it over once before opening it. Inside was a handwritten note, brief but unmistakable. "We know where you are. We're not coming to take you away. We just want to talk when you're ready." It was signed by all 3 children. Carol handed the letter to James. He read it twice. "No threats. No guilt," he said. "No begging either," Carol added. "Just waiting." He folded the note carefully. "They're learning." That night, they lit a fire and cooked lentils and rice over the iron stove. Carol read aloud from a book they found tucked between the floorboards, some forgotten anthology of poetry from the 60s. James listened, sketching in his notebook, his fingers smudged with charcoal. They didn't talk about the letter again that evening. There was no need. The next few days passed quietly. They fell into a rhythm defined not by urgency, but by intention. Mornings were for walking, afternoons for working. James finished repairing the last broken stair on the cabin's porch, and Carol began organizing the loft, converting it into a reading space. There were no clocks ticking them forward. They moved at their own pace. On a foggy Wednesday, they drove into town to visit the town clerk's office. Carol wanted to ensure the deed to the land was fully updated with current records. It was mostly formality, but it mattered to her that everything be in place, not just legally, but symbolically. The clerk, a woman named Nora with a slow drawl and a kind smile, confirmed the property was still listed under James Bennett. "Unclaimed, untouched, but never revoked," she said, flipping through a large leather-bound ledger. "It's rare for land to stay dormant this long without dispute." Carol signed the necessary updates. James leaned on the counter, eyeing the maps pinned behind Nora's desk. "I've been thinking," he said. "This place, I want to make it useful again, not just for us." Nora raised an eyebrow. "Useful how?" James looked at Carol, who waited. Then he said, "Maybe a place where people can come, disconnect, learn things again. Carpentry, gardening, cooking without microwaves. Real things. Carol was quiet, but something in her chest stirred. Nora nodded slowly. You wouldn't be the first to turn an old cabin into a retreat. There's interest for that kind of quiet. On the drive back, Carol finally spoke. You're serious. James kept his eyes on the road. I think I need to be. That night, they talked long after the fire went out. About what the land could become. About how they could share it. Not in a way that exposed their peace, but in a way that preserved and extended it. Maybe a seasonal program. Small groups. Even just family at first. It's not about legacy, James said. It's about presence. About doing something while we still can. Carol reached across the table and touched his hand. Then let's do it. One step at a time. And so, the road to Vermont became more than the physical journey that brought them here. It became the road within, a path back to self, to meaning, to shared purpose. James, who had once feared the erosion of memory, had found new ways to define identity. Carol, who had long carried the burden protecting him, had found space to breathe and build something of her own again. They were not escaping old age. They were rewriting what it meant. Lauren sat on the edge of her bed, laptop open in front of her, rereading the scanned letter their father had written. It was the third time that week she had returned to it, and still, it left her suspended in some limbo between admiration and heartbreak. She understood what he meant about presence. She had felt it too in rare moments, but she couldn't shake the hollow ache that came with being excluded from their journey. She missed her parents, missed them in the ordinary, everyday sense, grocery lists and quick calls, check-ins after doctor visits, Sunday dinners with too many leftovers. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and clicked open her email. A new message from Emily had just come in. Subject, call tonight. Text, 7 p.m. Don't be late. I'm serious. Lauren sighed and replied with a thumbs up out of habit, only realizing after how flippant it might look. She closed the screen and stared at the ceiling. Nothing about the situation was simple. That evening, the three siblings gathered on a video call. Emily was first to appear, her expression tight and unreadable. Josh joined next, yawning, his background lit with the flicker of a TV. I was watching something, he muttered as greeting. Emily ignored him. I've been thinking about Dad's letter, about what we actually know. Lauren raised an eyebrow. And we don't know anything. We know where they are. We know they're alive. But we don't understand what's going on. How long do they plan to stay there? What's their plan if Dad's condition worsens? Do they even have a long-term plan? They're not children, Em, Josh said, rubbing his face. They're old, yeah, but not helpless. I didn't say they were, Emily snapped, but he has memory issues. That doesn't just disappear because he found a peaceful cabin. What if he forgets where the stove is? What if he wanders off while Mom's asleep? Lauren leaned in. They left a letter. That's more than a lot of people get. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a choice. Emily crossed her arms. You're siding with them? I'm saying they deserve the benefit of the doubt, Lauren said. They raised us. They gave us decades of their lives. Maybe they're allowed a few months of freedom without reporting in every hour. Josh groaned. Can we not do this again? The same fight. Emily pressed on. This isn't about guilt. It's about being prepared. You want to wait until something happens and we're scrambling? Or we can try to be proactive, respectful, but still involved. Lauren shook her head. You mean in control? That's what this is about. I don't want control, Emily said. I want clarity. A timeline. A plan. Josh laughed bitterly. You want a plan for a man who just rewrote his will in the woods. Lauren exhaled slowly, trying to stay calm. Look, I get it. None of this is easy. But if we keep coming at this from fear, we're going to drive them farther away. That letter? That wasn't a cry for help. It was a boundary. Emily turned to Josh. So, what do you think we should do? Josh hesitated. I don't know. I mean, maybe we visit, not to confront them, just to see for ourselves. Not all at once. Just one of us. Quietly. Lauren considered it. They might see it as an ambush. Not if we're honest, Josh replied. One of us goes, spends a day or two, just reconnects. Emily didn't answer immediately. Her jaw tightened. Then, reluctantly, she nodded. Fine, but no showing up unannounced. If we do this, we ask first. Lauren looked surprised. You're agreeing? I'm agreeing, Emily said, because I can't keep worrying from a distance. And because I want to believe they're okay. I really do. Josh leaned back in his chair. Then who goes? There was a pause. Then Lauren spoke. Me. I'll go. Emily tilted her head. Why you? Because I've been the quiet one in all this. Maybe I'm the least threatening right now. Josh nodded. Makes sense. Emily hesitated, then relented. All right, but if they say no, if Mom says no, you do not push. I won't, Lauren promised. I'm not going to storm in there. I just want to see them. Let them know we're still here. The call ended soon after, but the unease lingered. That night, Lauren drafted a short email. No pressure, no accusations. Hi, Mom. Just wanted to say we got your letter. Thank you for that. I'm wondering if you'd be open to a short visit. No agenda. Just me. A few days, if that's all right. I miss you both. And I promise to respect whatever you need. With love, Lauren. She sent it before she could second-guess herself. 3 days passed with no reply. On the fourth morning, a response arrived. Just a few lines. Dear Lauren, thank you for your note. We're open to a visit, but gently. No pressure, no plans. Bring only yourself and good walking shoes. Love, Mom. Lauren read the message 3 times. Then she forwarded it to her siblings with a simple subject line. It's happening. Meanwhile, in the cabin nestled deep in the Vermont woods, Carol sat at the small kitchen table, James beside her, both watching the wind ripple through the trees. There was tension in her shoulders, but not regret. She's coming, she said. James nodded. It's time. The gravel crunched beneath Lauren's tires as she followed the hand-drawn directions her mother had emailed. Her GPS had given up 15 minutes earlier, just after the last recognizable road marker disappeared behind her. She'd driven past birch groves, over a narrow wooden bridge that looked like it hadn't been maintained in decades, and now she was climbing a slow incline surrounded by trees so dense they blocked out the late afternoon sun. She was nervous, not because she feared some dramatic confrontation. Her parents were not the type, but because this visit, however gentle, felt like stepping into a story she hadn't been invited to finish. She had been given permission, yes, but permission was not the same as inclusion. Not yet. When the cabin finally emerged through the trees, it was quieter than she expected. Not remote. Exactly. It wasn't so far from the road, but isolated in the way a sacred place often is. The structure itself was simple, time-worn but strong, with a new coat of sealant darkening the wood. Smoke curled lightly from the chimney. A stack of split logs sat neatly under a tin awning to the side. She parked the car slowly, turned off the engine, and stepped out. The air smelled of pine, moss, and something faintly sweet, maybe with smoke and cinnamon. The front door opened before she could knock. Carol appeared, hair tucked into a scarf, apron dusted with flour. Her smile was soft, cautious, and Lauren noted with relief, genuine. Hi, sweetheart. Lauren felt the tension in her chest begin to dissolve. Hi, Mom. They hugged at the threshold. Not tight, not rushed, just long enough to say what neither was ready to voice out loud. James was inside by the fire, pencil in hand, working quietly over a piece of wood clamped to a small table. He looked up as Lauren entered, smiled, then stood slowly and walked to her. Good to see you, he said. His eyes were clear. Alert. You too, she said and meant it. He hugged her, brief but warm. Then, gesturing toward the kitchen, he added, Your mother's been baking enough for 10 people. Carol waved a hand. There's soup on the stove. Sit. You must be tired. Over dinner, the conversation stayed light. They talked about the drive, about the weather, about the owl that had nested somewhere behind the cabin and hooted at all hours. James told her about the trails he'd been clearing and how he was building a bench for the east side of the lake. Carol mentioned a local woman in town who'd given her a recipe for wild blueberry jam. Not once did they mention the children's worry, the tension of the past weeks, or the letter Lauren had sent. The silence around those topics wasn't avoidance. It felt like ceremony, a waiting, an acknowledgement that time would open the conversation when it was ready. Later that evening, they sat outside, wrapped in blankets on the porch. The stars above them were brilliant, clearer than Lauren had seen in years. James sat with a mug of tea, Carol with a book on her lap. Lauren rocked gently in the old chair between them. "This place is beautiful," she said. James nodded. "It's quiet in the right way." Carol turned toward her daughter. "How are your brother and sister?" Lauren hesitated, worried, still, but less now, I think, especially once I told them I was coming. "We didn't want to worry anyone," Carol said softly. "We just needed to start breathing again." James added, "Not because of you three, because of the world we built. We were carrying it like it couldn't function without us." Lauren looked at them in the flickering light. Her parents didn't look like people who had run away. They looked like people who had returned to something they'd forgotten they'd ever known. "I understand that now," she said, "more than I expected to." They stayed quiet for a long time, the night surrounding them. Eventually, Carol rose, kissed Lauren's head, and went inside. James lingered. "You worried we'd lost ourselves," he said, not asking. Lauren looked at him. "I worried you'd been pushed too far and didn't want us anymore." He exhaled. "We wanted less noise, not less love." She reached for his hand. He squeezed it once firmly. The next morning, James took Lauren on a walk through the woods. They followed the edge of the lake, then climbed the ridge trail he had cleared by hand. He showed her the bench he'd just finished. Simple, solid, positioned to catch the sunrise. She sat beside him. "You're still strong." "I'm still here," he said. "Back at the cabin." Carol prepared a basket of things for Lauren to take home. A jar of jam, some dried herbs, a notebook James had bound by hand. It was not a farewell gift, but a gesture of sharing, proof that they were still living lives full of meaning and motion. Before Lauren left, she stood in the doorway, taking it all in, the smell of the fire, the shadows on the walls, the soft hum of contentment in the air. "Thank you for letting me come," she said. "You were always welcome," Carol replied. "We just needed to remember how to open the door." As she drove away, the cabin disappeared behind her, swallowed by the trees once more. But it no longer felt like a place of mystery. It felt like the center of something honest and rare. And for the first time in weeks, Lauren didn't feel divided. She felt whole. The rain came softly during the night, leaving a fine sheen over the forest that shimmered in the morning light. Carol stood at the edge of the cabin porch, arms crossed, watching the way the mist hovered just above the trees. It was still early, the kind of hour when the world hadn't quite made up its mind to be awake. She sipped her tea, listening to the slow creak of the old wood beneath her feet. Inside, James was pulling boxes down from the loft. He had woken with a sense of urgency that Carol hadn't seen in some time, not anxious but determined. Something about Lauren's visit had stirred something in him. He spoke of it only in passing, but Carol noticed in his movement, in the way he stood taller, in the steadier rhythm of his thoughts. He'd spent the last 2 days sorting through tools and scraps of lumber, but this morning he was focused on something else entirely. The old trunk beneath the floorboards. "I've been thinking," he had said the night before. "There might be more up there than we realized." Carol had assumed he meant memories, photographs, mementos, forgotten books. But now she watched as he carefully opened the trunk and began removing its contents piece by piece. There were stacks of yellowed papers, most of them curled and brittle at the edges. A few old photographs, a rusted lantern, and a folded woolen vest with one button missing. Beneath it all was a leather-bound ledger, heavier than it looked. James opened it slowly, dust trailing into the light. "What is it?" Carol asked, stepping closer. "His records," James replied, running his fingers across the pages. "My grandfather kept track of everything. Materials used, trees planted, land boundaries, building repairs. Look at this. He even marked which windows were replaced in which year." Carol leaned in. The handwriting was sharp and neat, in a dark ink that hadn't faded. But as she flipped to the back, something caught her attention. A pocket stitched into the inside of the cover, sealed with a small brass clasp. She unclipped it and pulled out a folded sheet of parchment. James peered over her shoulder. "What's that?" Carol unfolded it carefully. It was a hand-drawn map, more detailed than the one they had used to find the cabin. This one extended far beyond property lines they knew, stretching into areas marked only with initials and strange notations. At the bottom corner, in the same tidy handwriting, was a note. "Land parcels deeded but unregistered. See safe deposit box for titles." James stared at it. "I don't remember anything about a safe deposit box." Carol turned the page over. Written faintly in pencil were the words, "Box 417, Wells National Bank, Montpelier." She looked at James. "Do you think it still exists?" He didn't answer right away. Then he stood, almost too quickly. "We have to find out." The drive to Montpelier was quiet, but charged. They didn't talk much. Both of them knew the odds. How likely was it the box had been closed, or that any contents had been lost to time or bureaucracy? But something in the map's detail, in the handwriting, made Carol hopeful. It felt intentional. Preserved. The bank still stood where the map said it would, though it had since merged with a larger chain. The original name was gone from the signage, but the building itself hadn't changed. Inside, they were directed to a back office, where a man in his 60s listened carefully as James explained the situation. "I know this is strange," James said, laying the old map on the desk. "But my grandfather left this. He had an account here under the name Henry Bennett." The banker adjusted his glasses, scanning the page, then typed quietly into his computer. "Most boxes are closed after an activity," he said, not unkindly, "but if it was paid up in advance." He paused, eyes narrowing at the screen. James and Carol waited. Then the man smiled faintly. "Box 417. Still listed as active. Quarterly fee covered until 2040. Auto-drafted from a trust fund. You're listed as a beneficiary, Mr. Bennett." James blinked. "Seriously? We'll need ID, of course. And a signature. But yes, it's still here." A few signatures and a quiet elevator ride later, the vault door swung open with a heavy thud. The box was pulled, long and narrow, and placed before them. Carol's hand shook slightly as she opened it. Inside was a folder of documents, neatly arranged. At the top were several sealed envelopes, and beneath them, multiple folded deeds, real estate titles, land surveyor maps, and tax documentation. They stared at the paperwork in disbelief. There were 5 additional parcels of land, all within Vermont, ranging in size from small wooded lots to a 40-acre stretch bordering a state park. Carol reached for the first title. It was clear, uncontested, and listed James as a legal heir. James sat back slowly. "He never told me. Maybe he wanted you to find it this way," Carol said. "When you were ready." They took the folder and had copies made. The original box remained intact, but the documents in their hands felt impossibly real. As they walked out into the afternoon light, neither spoke. It wasn't just the land itself, it was what it meant. James's grandfather had planned for something beyond his own life. And now, decades later, that vision had fallen into their hands, asking to be seen, understood, built upon. Back at the cabin, they spread everything across the table. Maps, deeds, tax records, hand-drawn notes. Carol highlighted the parcel closest to their current home, a 10-acre lot just across the ridge. "This could be part of the retreat idea," she said quietly. "We'd have space for guests, for programs. It wouldn't disrupt the cabin." James nodded slowly. "And the others? What we do with those?" "We hold them," she said, "until we know why we were meant to have them." As evening fell, they lit candles instead of turning on the lanterns. The soft glow illuminated the papers before them like something sacred. Carol made tea, and James began writing notes, ideas, plans. It wasn't just about inheritance. It was about intention, about being trusted with something that still had purpose. And in that moment, surrounded by deeds and dreams, they realized the greatest treasure wasn't the land itself. It was a life they could now imagine living on it. The first snowfall came quietly. No wind, no warning. Just a gentle cascade of flakes settling over the trees and blanketing the path that led from the cabin to the lake. Carol noticed it from the kitchen window, just after dawn, the way the world had been muffled overnight. Everything had softened, even the light. James was already outside, clearing the woodpile, his breath visible in the cold air. Carol called to him from the doorway. "Don't stay out too long. You'll freeze before you finish." He looked up, smiling. "I've done worse in colder weather." Inside, the cabin smelled of rosemary and firewood. Carol had begun preparing stew early, stirring slowly as she waited. Today wasn't just another quiet morning in the woods. Today marked a shift. Lauren had written to say Emily and Josh were coming. They had not been invited, but they had not insisted either. They had asked, and Carol had said yes. She wasn't sure what to expect. Later that morning, James came in dusted with snow, cheeks pink. It's settling thick. Hope they have snow tires. They said they'd be here by noon, Carol replied. We'll see. James moved to the fire, setting another log in place, then sat back on a rug, stretching his legs. Feels strange, he said. Not bad, just strange. Carol nodded. It's time. That doesn't mean it will be easy. The hours passed slowly, the kind of pace that made time feel both full and hesitant. Carol tidied the space again, though there wasn't much to clean. James busied himself with little things, sharpening tools, adjusting the bookshelf, Rez tacking the firewood. Neither of them spoke about nerves, but both felt them settle quietly in the chest like a second breath. Shortly before noon, the distant sound of tires crunching over frozen gravel reached the cabin. Carol glanced at James. He didn't move. They're here, she said. She stepped onto the porch as two cars appeared beyond the bend. Emily emerged first, carefully zipping her coat. Josh followed, already carrying a small duffel. Neither looked tense, but both moved with that uncertain energy of people entering a space they do not fully understand. Lauren stepped out from the trees where she had been walking earlier, a knowing smile on her face. They found it, she said softly, joining Carol on the porch. Emily was the first to speak. Hi, Mom. Carol smiled. You made it. Josh waved awkwardly. This place is really something. Carol gestured them in. Come warm up. Inside, the fire glowed steadily. James stood as they entered, rubbing his palms together, face open but cautious. Emily stepped toward him. Hi, Dad. He embraced her before she finished the words. Not tight, not dramatic, just real. When they stepped back, there were tears in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. Josh approached next. You've been busy, he said, motioning to the shelves. The hand-repaired furniture, the lanterns now affixed with fresh wicks. James chuckled. There's nothing like free time in fresh lumber. They all laughed, and something shifted in the room. The tension didn't vanish, but it lessened like a curtain slowly drawing open. Carol poured tea and brought out fresh bread from the oven. The children sat at the table, each looking around the space with new eyes. This is beautiful, Emily said. And isolated, Josh added, but not in a bad way. James sat beside Carol. We needed quiet and space. Lauren broke the silence. They've done more than just live here. They've started something. There's more land, more plans. You should see the maps. Emily's brows rose. You mean the extra parcels? Carol nodded. We visited the bank. There were records. It's all James's. His grandfather left it behind. We've only just begun to understand it. Josh leaned forward. So what happens now? James looked at him. That depends on what you're asking. I mean, are you staying here permanently? Are we part of this? Carol answered slowly. This place isn't a secret anymore, but it's still sacred. What we decide to build, whether something small or something shared, has to come from that same intention. Emily nodded. We weren't sure you want us involved at all. James's voice softened. We didn't know if we could be at first, but Lauren's visit changed that. They talked through lunch, about the property, about how they'd been living, about the difference between being isolated and being free. Emily asked practical questions. heat sources, water filtration, long-term care plans. Carol answered each one calmly, no defensiveness, no evasion. Josh listened more than he spoke, but his eyes never stopped scanning the room, registering what had been built, what had been preserved. After the meal, Carol suggested a walk. James led them through the trail to the lake, pointing out the work he had done. At the ridge, they sat on the bench overlooking the water, the trees dusted in white. Emily exhaled. "You were right. This makes sense now." Josh nodded. "I didn't think I'd get it, but I do." Lauren smiled. "They haven't disappeared. They've just changed shape." James turned to them. "We're not asking you to understand everything today, just to accept that we're still here, and that we haven't finished becoming who we are." Carol added, "We love you. That has never changed. But this is ours. And now, maybe it can be yours too, in pieces, in time." As the sun began to fall, they returned to the cabin. That evening, the fire burned longer than usual. No one talked about going home yet. The reunion wasn't loud or overly emotional. It was steady. It was honest. And, perhaps most important of all, it was real. The snow hadn't stopped. By morning, the world outside was coated in a silent white, so deep and even that the trees themselves looked subdued. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low overnight, and Carol was already up, stoking it gently, coaxing the warmth back into the room. Emily stirred on the cot near the fireplace, wrapped in thick woolen blankets. Josh slept in the loft above, sprawled in a sleeping bag he had brought with him, his light snoring faintly audible through the slats. Lauren sat in the corner, a cup of tea in her hands, watching her mother move about the kitchen with quiet precision. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked softly. Carol smiled without looking up. "Some. Not much. But I don't mind. The day was not meant for tasks. The snow had made that clear. It was the kind of day that forced people to stop. And so they did, together at last, without urgency, without planning." The kettle hissed over the stove, and one by one, they gathered again around the table. James was the last to rise. He came into the room slowly, hands pressed into the small of his back, face marked by the stiffness of the night, but still wearing the quiet dignity he had carried since the beginning of their time in the cabin. He looked at his children and then at Carol. "Feels like we're in a painting," he said. Josh chuckled. "A very cold painting." Emily handed him a cup. "I'll forgive the lack of central heating." "Barely." They all laughed, and for a moment it was easy, light, even joyful. But the silence that followed had a weight to it, the kind that arrives only when everyone knows something important is waiting to be said. Lauren was the first to speak. "I think we should talk." Carol nodded. "Yes, we should." Emily glanced at her father. "You look well, Dad. Better than I expected." James smiled, but it was slower this time. "I have good days. This is one of them." Josh leaned forward. "And the not good days? They come," James said, "but they don't scare me the way they used to." Lauren folded her hands on the table. "When did it start?" There was no need to define it. They all understood. James took a long breath. "Little things. A few years back. Names. Directions. Then full conversations lost. Days I couldn't recall. At first, I blamed being tired. Or distracted. But then, he trailed off. Carol picked up where he left off. We saw a neurologist last spring. They called it early-stage cognitive decline. Not full Alzheimer's. Not yet, but it's progressing." Josh looked down. "Why didn't you tell us?" Carol's eyes were steady. "Because we didn't want you to start grieving before it was time." Emily blinked quickly, swallowing hard. "You could have leaned on us." "We weren't sure you could handle it," James said. "Not because you're not strong, but because it's a hard thing to witness. And we weren't ready to be watched that way." Lauren's voice was quiet. "You thought we'd start treating you like patients." James nodded. "Exactly." They sat with that for a while, letting it land, letting it stay. "I was angry," Emily said, "when we couldn't find you, when Mom stopped answering. I thought you didn't trust us." Carol reached across the table, her hand finding Emily's. I was afraid. Afraid that if I told you, it would change everything. That you'd stop seeing him as he is now and start only seeing what he might become. Emily wiped her eyes. I didn't know how much I needed to hear that. Josh added, and I didn't know how little I understood about what you were actually going through. James leaned back, his voice soft. There were days I woke up and didn't remember why we moved, or where we were going. Carol would bring me back, patiently, over and over. I'd ask the same questions. I'd make the same mistakes. But she never once made me feel small. Carol didn't react to praise. She just looked at her children, calm and steady. We've learned to live in smaller pieces of time, one morning at a time, one task, one smile, one walk. Lauren nodded slowly. That's what it felt like when I visited, like everything was happening with more care. James looked at her, because care is what keeps the memory of love alive when memory itself starts to fade. The room fell quiet again. Then Emily whispered, I regret trying to take control. I thought I was protecting you, but really I was trying to protect myself from the fear. Josh added, I regret not asking more questions. I assumed you were just being stubborn. I didn't stop to think you might be trying to preserve something. Carol's expression softened. You were all doing your best, and we don't blame you. James reached for the small journal he had been keeping. I write every day. What I remember, what I forget, what I'm afraid of, and what I hope for. He handed it to Josh. When the time comes, and it will, I want you to have this, so you'll know who I was when I still had the words. Josh took it carefully, not opening it, just holding it like something sacred. Thank you, Dad. Carol looked around the table. We don't want pity. We don't want you to mourn us while we're still here. What we want, what we need is presence, laughter, visits, and yes, space when it's necessary. Emily smiled through tears. We can do that. We can learn. James reached for Carol's hand. We all are. That evening, the snow fell heavier. The family stayed close, sharing stories from old holidays, flipping through albums Carol had kept in a wooden chest, and laughing at childhood drawings found in an old folder James had saved. They cooked together, slowly, making stew and warm biscuits and a pie from frozen berries Carol had foraged in the fall. At one point, as James drifted into sleep by the fire, Carol covered him with a quilt, then sat beside her daughters on the floor. Lauren looked at her mother. Are you afraid? Carol was quiet for a long time. Not of what's coming. I'm afraid of wasting what we have now, of not being present enough. Emily said, then let's promise to stay present. All of us, even when it's hard. Carol nodded. That's all we can ask for. The fire crackled. The snow whispered against the windows. And for the first time in a long while, there were no masks left to wear, no roles to perform, just a family in all its complicated love. Spring came late in the mountains, as it often did, pushing through the last snow with a kind of patient determination. It didn't announce itself loudly. There were no sudden bursts of color or dramatic thaws. It arrived slowly, like a story turning a page. One morning, the trees were bare. The next, small buds clung to their branches. The ground softened. The lake, once glassy with ice, moved again with wind and wildlife. At the cabin, the changes were just as quiet, but just as real. James stood by the open window in the early morning light, watching a deer wander near the edge of the woods. His face, thinner now, still held that same thoughtful stillness he had carried all winter. Some days were slower than others. There were gaps in his thoughts that lasted longer than they used to. He would occasionally forget where he had placed things or pause in the middle of a task, unsure of what he had been doing, but he hadn't forgotten where he was, or who he was. Not yet. Carol joined him at the window, carrying 2 mugs of tea. Looks like the garden might be ready this week, she said, her eyes scanning the soil they had cleared last fall. James nodded. You'll need help. She smiled. You'll supervise. He chuckled quietly. From the porch. In truth, the porch had become his favorite place, the wooden bench he had built now his usual post. From there, he watched birds, read, sketched, and sometimes just sat, letting time move through him without demand. By mid-April, the first of their guests arrived, not strangers, but family. Lauren returned with her husband and their toddler, who tottered around the yard with a kind of wild glee that made James laugh every time he fell into the leaves. Josh came a week later, bringing camping gear and a small charcoal grill, eager to help build a second woodshed on the edge of the property. Emily came last, as she had always preferred to do, arriving with her partner and 2 suitcases full of ingredients, claiming she would be doing the cooking for a while, whether anyone liked it or not. No one argued. The cabin, once a place of retreat, began to stretch at the seams with the sounds of living. Meals around the table grew longer. Afternoons turned into group walks through the trails. The older children helped James organize the woodshed plans, while the younger ones asked questions about every tool he touched. Carol taught them how to knead bread on the wide pine counter. Emily built a new pantry shelf in the back corner, insisting it would help civilize the chaos. But amid the growing sense of activity, there remained a profound stillness at the center. James and Carol, living not behind the scenes but within them, present, available, leading not with instruction but with rhythm. One afternoon, as Carol and Emily worked side by side in the garden, James sat on the porch sketching again. His hand was slower now, but steady. He wasn't drawing the cabin this time. Instead, he was sketching the garden as it took shape, including the silhouettes of Carol and their daughter hunched over the soil. He shaded carefully around them, letting the pencil linger in their outlines. Lauren approached quietly with a mug in hand. She sat beside him without saying anything, just watching the pencil move. "I'm not drawing faces anymore," James said softly. Lauren looked over. "Why not?" "Because sometimes they don't come to me. But I remember how people stand, how they move, how they lean in when they care." She touched his arm gently. "It's beautiful, even without faces." He nodded. They know who they are. In the evening, they gathered around the fire pit outside. The children roasted marshmallows. The adults sipped tea or wine. Someone played music from a small speaker, and someone else, probably Josh, told a story that made them all laugh too loud. James sat in the circle, wrapped in a quilt, Carol beside him. It was in that moment that Emily looked around the circle and said, not for the first time, "We could do this every year." Carol smiled. "That's the idea." Josh added, "And maybe bring some friends next time. Make a thing." Carol looked at James, who nodded slowly. "We're not turning it into a resort," he said, eyes twinkling. "No," Lauren replied, "just a place that grows." In the following weeks, they began making plans more deliberately. Carol and Emily mapped out a schedule for family stays. Lauren helped draft an idea for small season retreats, quiet gatherings for caregivers, artists, people who needed stillness more than advice. Josh researched solar panels and composting toilets. James, more often than not, simply observed. His role, once central, had become more ceremonial, but no less meaningful. The space around him was filled with echoes of his efforts. Every plank of wood, every repaired hinge, every carefully stacked book or folded blanket held a trace of his hands. He no longer felt the need to be in control. He simply wanted to be part of the passing. And that, perhaps, was the greatest gift age had given him. One morning, near the end of spring, he and Carol sat again on the porch. The trees had leafed out fully now. The lake glimmered. A breeze stirred the chimes above the doorway. Carol reached for his hand. "We did it," she said. James nodded. "What did we do?" She smiled, unoffended. "We made something that didn't exist before. Not just a cabin, not just the land, but this rhythm, this peace." James squeezed her fingers gently. "Feels like it's always been here." "Maybe it has," she said. "We just had to be still long enough to find it." That afternoon, as the grandchildren chased one another around the edge of the woods and the others prepared dinner in the kitchen, James sat with his sketch pad one last time. He wrote only one sentence. The treasure was not in the land, but in the life it allowed us to build. And with that, he closed the book. He didn't need to add anything else.